Welcome to the Anytime Show. I'm your host, Dustin Dye. First off, a little bit of housekeeping. At the end of my last episode, I may have asked supporters of this channel to donate by sending me cash in the mail. It has come to my attention that it sounded like I was trying to evade the tax man. So a better way to send me money is through PayPal. The link will be in the description. So my guest today is my friend and author, Chiluba Musonda. He has a book, Home Away from Home, which we'll talk about in this broadcast. Chiluba, thanks for coming and welcome to the Anytime Show.
Hey, Dustin, my good friend. So honored to be here and so honored for the opportunity to talk to you and your listeners. I am looking forward to this great conversation. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about your background for people, maybe someone, 2 or 3 people out there have not purchased Home Away from Home yet.
Yes, which is $12, I might add. That includes taxes. It's actually $11.93. The book costs $10.95, but you got to pay the tax man his money. So it's about $12.
We'll talk about that tax man thing afterwards. But a little bit about your background. What brought you here to Kansas City, and what was your journey?
Sure. So my journey to Kansas City is, to me, a pretty fascinating story. And I say that because I'll take you back to 2003. It was my last year in high school. I just completed most of my coursework. The academic calendar year in Zambia, which is my home nation, the academic calendar begins in January and ends in December. So right before the end of the year, my mother approached me. I still remember her barging through my room. You know, mothers, they never knock on the door. She barges through and says, "Hey, son, it's time to talk about college." This may have been maybe September, late August, early September. And at the time, I always knew I was going to go somewhere to school. I was going to further my education. But in the back of my mind, I figured it would be in Zambia, one of the local universities or colleges there, in my hometown of Lusaka, which is the capital city. Or I would be fortunate enough to maybe go to a neighboring country, South Africa, Namibia, something like that. And if I was really, really lucky, maybe the United Kingdom. So these were kind of the ideas that were formulating in my head about furthering my education. So in speaking with Mom when she barged through the door, she said, not only should we be thinking about college, I want you to consider applying to a university in the United States of America. And Dustin, I was like, whoa, United States, the home of Tupac, Biggie, Nas, Nelly, Jay-Z, sign me up. Where do I sign up? And that was what was in my mind. My mother, on the other hand, was thinking about furthering my education, maybe gaining access to internships and being exposed to the West. And there's no better place than America. So as soon as my mother planted that seed of coming to the United States, my mother and I started doing some research as to what colleges we could apply for. And at random, Dustin, my mother and I still remember this, on our home computer, we sat down and did a Yahoo search. This was before Google was the big thing, and typed in that Yahoo search engine, mid-sized American colleges. And what that brought to us, that search pulled up, at the time, I think it was 50 plus schools in the United States. And at random, I selected 4 universities. The first that I was going, these 4 were the 4 that I was going to apply to at random. Didn't know where I was going as long as it was within the United States. The first was Southern University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Colgate University in the Northeast, I think it's a liberal arts school. University of Utah in Salt Lake City, so out west. And the University of Missouri here in Kansas City. So I applied at random, and UMKC was the first and the only institution to respond to my application, and the rest is history. So that's kind of how I ended up in Kansas City.
Sound like you dodged 3 bullets there.
I probably did.
Welcome to America, the home of Tupac and Merle Haggard and Garth Brooks.
Yeah.
Keith Urban.
It's funny you say Keith Urban. I actually kind of like Keith Urban. Not as much as I like Tupac, but just he's won me over with some of his songs.
I couldn't. I might have to turn in my white card, but I don't think I can name one Keith Urban song. So speaking from your point of view is coming from Ukasa,
Yeah, you got it right, Lusaka.
Zambia. Um, how does America appear from the outside? Because when you're a fish, you don't know the water. So coming from outside the fishbowl, what is the perception of America?
Great. I actually talk about this extensively in my book.
Home Away from Home.
Home Away from Home.
How much was that again?
$12. It's on Amazon. Home Away from Home. It's a great book. I talk about that extensively in the book. And Dustin, America's greatest export, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm no economist, even though I took a bunch of economics courses at UMKC, is Hollywood. It's Hollywood, it's MTV, and to some degree, it might even be some of your news channels like CNN. So the perception of the United States is formed, or is at least the painting or the image of this country is created by Hollywood. So I put yourself in my shoes. Young kid in Africa, loves my soccer, loved hanging out with friends, and somebody approaches me and says, hey, what do you think about going to the United States? The first thing that comes to my mind, or to, at least at that time, was Hollywood. I promise you, Dustin, before I stepped one foot in this place that I call home now, I assumed by coming to America, I would instantaneously become rich. And a lot of people around the world, and I'm being honest, think this. They think this is the land of endless milk and honey. I'll tell you what hasn't helped either is social media. And what do I mean by that? When immigrants, the average immigrant, and I'll speak to those at least who are from my country and in specific, my hometown, when we come to the United States, we have this need to show the people back at home that we're doing well, regardless of what's going on here on the ground. So whenever we post images on Facebook, on our social media pages, we're always showing what is perfect, what is best, what is happening. What we don't show, and I'm speaking, and I feel comfortable making this generalization, is the struggle. You know, some of the racism you have to deal with, the way people stereotype you as an immigrant. It's hard to find work. The immigration system. You think about the administration that we have right now in the country, that is not so welcoming to immigrants. The average immigrant won't project that image back home. We tend to only show the good side. So when people think of America, they're thinking Hollywood. In fact, they're thinking two cities, to be honest. They're thinking Los Angeles, California, and New York City. And specific to New York City, they're thinking Manhattan, where the big skyscrapers are. That's it. You might throw in Florida and Vegas. They don't know about the heart of the Midwest. They don't know about the small towns. If you explain to somebody in my hometown that 40% of Americans live in poverty, they wouldn't believe it. Because from their perspective, they'll be like, what do you mean by poverty? Are we talking African poverty, or are we talking about the fact that they have everything but just can't pay one or two bills? So there is that huge misconception. And in my book, I try to paint my reality in America for the reader back at home to understand this is not the land of endless milk and honey. There are great things happening in this country, but there are also some things that are not so great.
So it's not so the perception from outside is the kind of the Instagram perception, which is social media is just like the really nicely painted fence surrounding someone's yard full of dog shit.
Exactly.
Basically. I mean,
Exactly.
Not speaking for myself, my life is every bit as good. I mean, I'm sure you and I'm sure you, my life is every bit as good
That's
as I
right.
pretend. I mean, it's as I project on social media, especially Instagram.
I believe you, Dustin. And they do too.
Thank you. Thank you. But since we're on the topic of your book, there was actually one episode in here that I thought was very interesting. Well, I'll have you, since I have the author here, I'll have you read it,
Sure.
and then we'll discuss it on page. The bookmarked it. We're on these two paragraphs on page 148 for those of you following along at home.
Now, what's interesting, Dustin, is ever since, and this book was published back in 2015, so it's been out for about 5 years. It's still very relevant. to your viewers and readers, those of you who would like to get a perspective on what life is like as an immigrant in the United States. So it's still very relevant, but it's been 5 years, and I say that to say I tend not to go back and reread my work. Once I published it, once it was out there, I was done with it. So thank you for opening up that scab and that wound. All right.
You're welcome.
So here we go. My interaction with Troost Avenue would not end there. During my 3rd year at UMKC, my soccer buddies and I happened to be driving along Kansas City's infamous racial border. We were heading back from an indoor soccer game in the north part of town, heading back to UMKC's bulk of campers. In the car were my 3 soccer teammates and a young lady from Europe who happened to be our unofficial cheerleader. As we approached the school, the young lady turned to my friend from Mexico and said, "I can't stand black people." Everyone in the car went silent. And very quickly, she turned to me, the only black guy in the car, and said, "Not you. You are different from them. You are practically white." Everyone in the car broke out in laughter, but I remained puzzled by what I had just heard. In order to keep the peace, I chuckled softly and looked outside the car window, observing my fellow black brothers and sisters who were lined up waiting at the bus stop as we happened to drive past them. Did this young European friend of mine dislike black people? Or did she despise folks of lower economic status than hers? Only time will tell. Her statement and my interaction with these guys made me feel like a sellout. That was hard to read, Dustin. It's hard to read. These are my own words, and it's just hard to read.
It was hard to read when I read it, because I know you well, and as we were talking before this, turned out I know the young woman too. So yeah, it was hard to read, and since I know you, I could, even if I didn't know, I'd be able to empathize and kind of feel the pain that you were getting across there. But as I reflected on that later on, I thought that there's actually some hope in that story. So if you want to kind of look at it from another angle.
Sure.
I know it was hard for you. It was hard to hear it again too.
Mm-hmm.
But she said, "You're not like them.
Mm-hmm.
You're." Words like it's like you're white. Or
she said, "You're practically
white."
Yeah.
So
and for your viewers, come on, I'm as dark as they come. I'm a dark chocolate brother, and I'm proud of it.
Heard it here first. But what do you think she meant by that?
Well, what I assume in African Americans, black folk, whatever term you want to use, those of a certain those that reach a certain educational level, those that reach a certain economic standing, they tend to be perceived as non-black. And where I find that troubling, it is almost like because I was playing soccer and I was hanging out with them and I was in college and I was enunciating words a certain way, saying words a certain way, I was going by my English name, John, at the time. In my mind, what she was doing was not acknowledging my blackness, my Africanness, if that's even a word. I just made that up.
It is now.
It is now.
It'll be on, it's on Wiktionary.
There you go.
It will be by the time I get home.
I love that. She was whitewashing me, literally, by saying, "You're practically white, you're not black." A better way that conversation could have gone, and I don't think there's any better way, because she's saying this in reference to seeing black folk standing by the bus stop and saying, "I don't like them, but I like you." The question we need to ask is, why doesn't she like them? Nobody puts themselves in their own circumstances for the most part. We are creatures of our environment. We respond to our environment. I could have been one of those people at the bus stop. I'll tell you why I wasn't, because I had a mother who barged through my door a year or a year or two earlier than that, saying, you got to go to college. I come from a college-educated home. My father's got a bachelor's degree in engineering. My mother's got a master's degree in environmental science. My sister is a medical doctor trained in Russia and now working back on the continent of Africa. So all of these environmental things that I had nothing to do with allowed me to be the person that I am today. And for her to fail to recognize that tells me where we go wrong as a country and as a society.
You think what would be like the most charitable reading of what she could have said if you wanted to be even nicer than you were? If you said, maybe when she said you're white, she recognized you, maybe not whitewashing you, but recognized you as an in-group, as part of an in-group, while they were kind of the out-group.
You know what? I've never looked at it that way. And I would assume that consciously, and again, here we are, we're talking about somebody we both know, consciously, I think that's what she was doing. She was bringing me into the group, letting me know you're one of us, which is welcoming at the time. You know, these are my friends. You see me as part of the group. What's troubling is why was that group of individuals that we were driving past that were predominantly African American, why did she choose to see them as the out group? You know, and that's where, you know, no hard feelings to this individual. We were in our early 20s. Maybe that person's not even the same person today. But that sentiment is shared by a lot of people in this city, in this country, where I learned this from a book that I read that talks about the phrase uplift suasion. And suasion comes from the word persuade, where Black people are only good enough when they uplift themselves. It's almost like you have to uplift yourself economically, educationally, to persuade white folk to bring you in the group, when we should be embracing our brothers and sisters just the way they are. When I look at everyone creates in groups and out groups. Most people do it on economic terms. So to give her some grace, maybe she was thinking, all of us in this car are college students. All of us come from middle class backgrounds, whether it's from different continents. So we're one group. But the problem with that analysis, there was still a tinge of racism. Why did she have to say you're practically white? That could have gone without saying. I don't like those guys, but you know what? Everyone in this car is cool with me. That could have been received a little bit differently. And I just think, as a society, in order for us to do better, we need to get to the point where we embrace and acknowledge everybody for who they are. Dustin, you're cool with me, you're my friend, because of Dustin, the unique characteristics you have. When you and I traveled together in Boston, and I got to learn about you and your family, and we drank a bunch of Sam Adams. That was some good times. And those were expensive beers, by the way. Very expensive. I learned about you as a person, forgetting about your background, where you grew up, whether you grew up on the Missouri side or the Kansas side. That didn't matter. I saw you as a human being. And I know, in being your friend over these years and your former coworker, you've seen me the same way. Yes, I'm from Africa, but that's not my entire story. That's not the entire package. There's a human being there. And I would like to assume that that young lady has reached that level of understanding, and she did that being young and immature. But you have to see people for who they are. Peel off the layer of race and see them for who they are. Meet them where they are. Sorry to sound professorial.
No, I think that's kind of what one of the points I was trying to get at, or see if you were there too. I think right now we are, fortunately, it's 2020 and we decided to draw a bunch of battle lines. And the more you parse it out, the more obvious it gets that we can only get along as if we see each other as individuals and get past these, frankly, kind of arbitrarily drawn lines, and really see each other for as the individuals. I think that was a lot of what were America's founding principles, even if they weren't carried out perfectly. But I'm worried that we're losing that. But the other part was the in-group part. And wondering if another way to get past all these divisions is if somehow she had her in-group, and it might have just been the people in the car. But if there's a way to expand the in-group out to include everyone in America, obviously without an out-group, there can't be an in-group, but for the purposes of not burning this country down, I think it needs to be drawn out. The circles need to go wider than your class or your race or where you're from. We need to figure out how to be truly inclusive. How do we include everybody or a lot more people into the in-group? Do you have?
Absolutely. I love what you just said, Dustin. And I hope that's a piece that your audience will really tune in and hone into and zone into, because what you just said is exactly my governing philosophy. You know, the best way I could piggyback on what you said was when I served as the director of the Bruce R. Watkins Cultural Heritage Center, a center that was built in 1989 to celebrate African-American culture and history, and to also celebrate the life of Mr. Bruce R. Watkins. He was one of the first African-Americans elected to the city council here in Kansas City. And I was fortunate to serve as the director of that building for 3 years. One of the best conversations I had was with a volunteer historian, an older African-American male who is deceased now. His name was Joe Lewis Maddox. He comes into my office and says, "Hey, I got a question for you, Mr. Director." And he, again, at the time, Joe Lewis may have been in his late 60s, early 70s, and I was in my early 30s. And he says, "I got a question for you." And I said, "What's the question, sir?" He said, "Now that you're this fancy director with your fancy office, the question is, can Black people in America succeed by themselves?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean? What are you getting at?" He said, "Well, let me put it to you this way. Did you make it this far by yourself, with Black hands, Black help only?" And I sat back, Dustin, and I said, well, without answering that question, I told him, without answering directly, I told him, you know what? If you're trying to get me to say, how can Black people fix themselves? The answer is simple. Black people need to do for themselves, by themselves, for themselves. Forget white folk, let's fix ourselves. Let's support each other. Let's lift up Black-owned businesses. Let's marry within the same group. I gave him the answer that I thought he was looking for. Again, this was an older African-American man. He was here during the civil rights era. So I'm trying to impress him with my Blackness by saying, we got to be pro-Black and forget the others. You know, we're talking about groups and circles. And he looked at me and said, "Look at that degree on the wall." And I had my master's degree on the wall. He said, "Where'd you get that from?" I said, "Well, University of Missouri, Kansas City." He said, "Who educated you? Who are your professors?" I said, "Majority of them were white." He said, "Okay, what about your bachelor's degree? Who educated you?" I said, "Again, white folk." He said, "Who's your supervisor? You're a director of this building, but you report to somebody. Who is that person?" I said, "It's a white man and a white woman." He said, "Did you ever get scholarships?" I said, "Yes." "Who gave them to you?" "Do you remember the scholarship committee?" I said, "Majority of the people in the committee were white folk." He said, "So you mean to tell me, here you are," at the time it was 2017 or 16, he says, "Here you are saying Black people need to do for themselves when you have attained your level by getting help from people who don't look like you." And he pretty much chastised me and said, in order for us to move forward, we need each other. It's hard to do things exclusively by one group. And what he was trying to say is what you said, is expanding that circle. And he was right. And I think about my life today and my friends, and I think about how I've been enriched. As a proud African immigrant, my life has been enriched by Black folk in this country, by white folk, by straight people, people who are gay, people who are Hispanic, people who don't look like me. Some do, some don't. Some people speak English with a certain accent, some others don't. My life is better off because I personally have expanded my group, my circle, and my life is better off. I think I have progressed better. Economically, I think I've even done better because I have opened myself up to others. Now, I'm still pro-Black, but I've expanded my in-group, and I'm better off for that. So I think if we can get people to understand that we need each other more than we understand, we would be better off.
I don't want to deny pluralism, but there could be pluralities within a larger circle.
Right.
Not that I needed the last word, but
Right. No,
just clarifying.
this is your show. You get the last word.
So let's go back to some of your views from, because you're from Zambia and then you came here, then you got a master's in public administration.
That's right.
And I recall you'd written a paper with what might sound like heterodox views on foreign aid. So, and we didn't get really deep into that in the past, but it was something that kind of interested me.
Sure.
Because from what I understood of your views is that they weren't immediately self-serving. So I kind of wanted to hear more of your views on foreign aid. So
Dustin, I'll put this out there, and I want to make sure that both you and your viewers understand my perspective on this. You know, I've lived in Kansas City for about 16 years. It'll be a complete 16 years this December. And most of the views I offer and my perspective about matters on the continent of Africa are a little skewed because I've been here for 16 years. Have I traveled back and gone back home? Yes, but that is different from those who actually live and breathe African air 24/7, 365 days of the year. I don't. You know, I get to pop in and out. I'm here in Kansas City. So my view is my view and my view alone, and is my perspective.
Well, I was going to ask if your views would be considered controversial.
To some, they might be, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. So let's dive in. When it comes to foreign aid, I'm highly suspicious of foreign aid the way it's packaged in today's terms. And what do I mean by that? You know, the old saying, and you can say it better than me. Is it better to give a man a fish and feed him for a day, or teach him how to fish so he can survive for the rest of his life? I butchered that, by the way, but you get the gist of it. The problem I have with foreign aid is foreign aid is taxpayer money from the United States. Now, in the beginning of this conversation, I talked about 4 out of 10 Americans are technically living in poverty, but they pay their taxes, sales tax, property tax, they pay all kinds of taxes. The federal government takes that money, gives the majority of it to the military industrial complex, and does other things with it. Funds healthcare, that's one of the biggest parts of the United States federal government's budget. And then there's a small little percentage that's dedicated to foreign aid to help those in need, countries like Zambia and many countries on the continent of Africa, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So you have poor folk here who are paying their taxes, their government in turn takes that money and sends it over in terms of resources and money to foreign governments in Africa. The problem is most of those funds don't make it to the starving kids you see on those ads. When you see the starving kid ads, most of those kids don't end up receiving that money. I'll tell you where that money goes. Again, my opinion here. And a lot of people have done research, and I did research on this as well. Ends up in the hands of some of the most corrupt governments on the continent of Africa. My problem with foreign aid is threefold. It props up bad actors. So when we donate money and give money to my fellow brothers and sisters who need the resources, when we send that money to countries in Africa, does our government really verify and check to find out if these governments are following democratic, small letter D, practices? Are we really investing the time to know if these governments are corrupt or not? Are we really investing the time to find out how much for every dollar, how much actually gets in the hands of those starving kids, those mothers who need help? We don't. So we're propping up bad governments because we're just giving out money. There are governments in sub-Saharan Africa whose entire budget, majority of it, a good portion of it, relies on foreign aid. How could that be? Africa, believe it or not, folks, is the world's richest continent in terms of resources. But we have the poorest countries economically. But we still keep sending money. It's believed since the late 70s, since African countries became independent from the 1950s onward, the United States government has spent trillions of dollars on the continent of Africa. And what has that brought us? The life expectancy in Africa is still the lowest in the world. We still have people who go on living on $1 a day. How are we holding those governments accountable? We're not. So we're propping up bad governments. Number two, a lot of the foreign aid that you see, even with the nonprofits, they mean well. And I'm sure some lives are being saved. But part of it are these feel-good projects that people are doing. Have you ever seen the average American person who is doing missionary work and goes to the continent of Africa? Half the time they're there to get a selfie. Look at this picture, me, white person, with all these starving black kids. I'm saving lives. I wrote articles on that. I got a question to people who do that. By the way, that bothers the shit out of me. Excuse my language. Why not do that here? Why don't you go find minority communities here and take those pictures and help your own here before you try and go across the world and help others? So again, a lot of these foreign aid projects are feel-good projects for the average American. Look at what I'm doing. I'm saving somebody. Somebody who was going without is now eating. We don't know if that's really the case. So propping up bad governments, feel-good projects, and then we're destroying economies. What do I mean by that, you might ask? So let's say, and I love Bill and Melinda Gates, and without them, thousands, maybe even millions would have died without the efforts they've made on the continent of Africa. But I got a question for them. Let's say the Bill, and this is hypothetical, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation decide to donate hundreds upon hundreds of mosquito nets to people on the continent of Africa. Why mosquito nets? Because malaria is one of the biggest, or at least when I was growing up, was one of the biggest diseases on the continent. And one way to prevent malaria is by investing in mosquito nets so that when people go to bed, mosquitoes don't bite them, and then that way blood is not being moved from one person to another through the mosquitoes. You're preventing the spread of malaria with mosquito nets in simple terms. So if the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation decide to flood the Zambian market with mosquito nets that were made in China or made here in Kansas City and send them to Zambia, the question I have for you, Dustin, what happens to the local mosquito net manufacturer in Zambia? Because America is coming in and donating this stuff for free. What happens to the guy who's trying to build his business? Forget mosquito nets, donating bags of rice. Much needed. There are people starving, and without those donations from the United Nations, they'll be dead. But what happens to the local rice farmer? What happens to his produce, his output? What happens to that woman who is a subsistence farmer who's growing her own crops? Where can she sell her crops when people are receiving stuff for free? So you're destroying economies, and it's not deliberate, it's inadvertent. You're creating these feel-good projects where people feel good, like, oh, I saved somebody today, when you're really not in the long term. And then you're propping up bad governments. That's just my philosophy, and that's what that paper was about. And I know people will comment and disagree and say, that's rich coming from you. I'm now in the United States. Do people need help? Absolutely. But I'm interested in long-term fixes, not short-term fixes. Yeah, you fed people for today, but what's going to happen next year's drought or 5 years from now's drought? Are we going to continue throwing bags of rice from these airlifted planes? What are we doing here, Dustin? So I just want to put that out there. You can chime in now.
Oh, I don't want to immediately say that I agree with all those, but I do want to, I'll be the devil's advocate.
Sure.
Be the white devil.
Yeah.
So, yeah, as a U.S. taxpayer, I actually don't mind that percentage goes to foreign aid. Most of the taxes I pay are actually state, local, property tax, sales tax, which stays more or less in my area. And as far as federal taxes go, I mean, the way it actually works, we can drive a few miles down the street to the Federal Reserve, and when you go in there, they give you these little bags of money
Money,
that are all shredded up. It's like, if we're so much in debt, why are they shredding up money? And the way federal taxes work is that this is just an aside, but they take your money, throw it in the trash, and then they print new money to spend. So it's not really my tax money that's going over there. So, I mean, even if it was, I'm okay with what would probably amount to a few pennies from me going to another government.
Even if it's doing damage to the people?
I'll get to that part. Like, if it was doing good, even more so. But yeah, propping up bad governments you don't have to read very much into the news to find an example. You can read The Economist any given week. I think I have one here, and find examples of corruption in Africa. So your first point is well taken. The money, we think it's going to the neediest people. It's really going to people with the stickiest fingers.
That's right.
And whoever, what gets down to the neediest people is what manages to slip through their fingers as they're grabbing. So
that's correct.
So that is one of my biggest problems. And then the white savior stuff. These people who are going there for the selfies.
Yes. The white savior mentality, it bothers me, and I want your viewers to know, and it bothers a lot of us. We need to get over that.
Yeah, if you do it, don't take a selfie with poor children. I mean, take pictures while you're there. You know, there's a lot of beautiful landscapes and beautiful cities, but the ones where it's like, here I am.
Yeah, with the two starving kids in my hand. Yeah, I mean,
that's done for the likes, and it's self-serving. It's disrespectful to those people.
It is, and don't lose your train of thought, but you're a connoisseur of different cultures. You're a well-traveled person. That is disrespectful. Yeah.
Well, I studied in South Africa, and I made a point of taking 0 pictures inside the townships.
Right.
When I take the pictures, it's like, from Table Mountain and like,
the scenery and the landscape and
Cape Town,
Right.
But like, I deliberately avoided taking any pictures inside the townships because it's disrespectful. Like, for me to be like, come from here and say, look at the poverty and look how adventurous I am to come here.
Right.
So yeah, seeing those selfies and I just roll my eyes every time.
It's bothersome, and I don't want you to lose your train of thought, Dustin, but remember how we kind of started this conversation before we started talking about foreign aid, when you asked me about the perception of America? In my book, so my book is twofold. I'm painting a picture for people back on the continent of Africa about how my reality in Kansas City is. And then on the flip side of that, I'm also painting a picture to you, the American reader, about what my reality was back in Lusaka, Zambia. So it's twofold. People are getting 2 different perspectives through my eyes. Now, why am I saying that on this point of foreign aid? Dustin, let's call a spade a spade. What is the perception of Africa to the average American person? I do speeches, talks, presentations, and the questions I always get they're just dumbfounding to me. So just be honest for your viewers. You won't offend me. What is the perception of Africa? You asked me about America's perception. What's the perception of the continent of Africa?
Starvation, droughts.
Starvation, droughts.
Yeah.
War,
yeah.
AIDS, Ebola, excessive corruption.
Yeah.
So that perception, which we're just generalizing what the average person might think is on the continent of Africa, is not the entire case. There's a lot of positive things going on the continent of Africa. In fact, I would like to believe 50 years, 100 years from now, Africa will be driving the world economy the way China is today. That's just my belief. A lot of economists believe that. When you think about population growth, sub-Saharan Africa has the youngest population on average on continent. The resources that are being discovered, more education, we're opening up different types of local industries. Africa is on the move, but that never gets portrayed in the media because why? They're always showing the starving kids. Now, is there rampant poverty? And are majority of the people in the continent of Africa having a hard time and poor? I would say yes, but there's also the other side that never gets seen. So perceptions, Dustin, matter. And why do they matter? The way you engage with a fellow human being is based on a perception you have. As you and I are doing this interview, if somebody who you and I perceive with our eyes as danger comes through that door, you and I will respond differently. When somebody who doesn't look dangerous comes in, we might sit back and welcome them. It's all about perception. So if the average American thinks that Africa is poor, poverty, and disease, how do you think they interact with Black folk? What do you think their perception is of their fellow Black human being? It's problematic. So some of this, the racism that we deal with, the stereotyping, comes from this negative image we have of the continent of Africa. And you've known me for several years. That's why I always try and put the best foot forward of Africa. I'm trying to convince people, no. We're just like you. We have our own cultures that are unique to us. We have our own little flavor, but we're human beings too. Those negative perceptions define the way we interact with one another. That's why we can't be seen as equal, because of these negative perceptions. The reason why Americans are viewed as superhuman is because of Hollywood. People sit back in India, in the Middle East, on the continent of Africa, and we're looking at Brad Pitt and all these superstars. They look like gods, because that's the perception Hollywood is feeding us. Can you imagine if we flip that over? If every time somebody turned on the TV, we showed the best parts of Africa, the beautiful landscapes, beautiful buildings, the unique cities, the cultures, the beautiful food, they would respond differently to their fellow, not only African immigrants, but to even Black folk in this country. There's this assumption that everything that comes from Africa is wrong, is subpar, and I disagree with that. Sorry to get long-winded there.
No, I think that is perception that's hurting. Because the problems look simple from the outside, like, oh, they're poor. They need this village, they don't have water. They have to walk a long way to get water. So simple, we go and we build a well.
Right.
And I saw one article about these wells, and they found a way to pump up water, like with using like these merry-go-rounds.
Yes.
Yeah, you
Only
see
with
that
that,
article.
yes.
Yeah. People haven't read the article. They found turn these merry-go-rounds, and it'll pump water up the shaft and down into the trough or wherever. Right. And so while the children play,
yeah,
they're also pumping water. It's so great. We built a little playground, and but now the children have to play there to pump the water. In fact, they might have actually destroyed an actual well to make this playground. And now the children have to play there. If they don't want to play there, then they have to push this. Now you have child labor to pump the water. But you got the selfie out of it. So
I love that. And sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. A lot of the projects that happen on the continent of Africa have these huge unintended consequences that sometimes do more damage than good. And I just wish those who are in the foreign aid business would take a step back while we're rushing to save lives. And sometimes there are immediate needs. Think of the earthquakes in Haiti. Haiti's on the Western Hemisphere. I know that's not on the continent of Africa. We needed the Red Cross there. We need to feed people. We need to airlift people. We need to give them medical supplies. I'm not against that. I want to make sure your viewers understand. What I'm against is this industry that exists that sent people over every summer to go build wells and read the Bible to the kids, and
that'll feed them.
I'm against that. And again, nothing against the Bible. I'm a proud Christian brother, but that's not saving lives in the long term. Now, people might say it's saving souls. Hey, we can have that debate, but we're talking about saving lives. That's not it. I would rather we focus on building local industries, getting people to solve their own problems. Because at some point, whether it's myself, people who have left the continent, people who are on the continent, we're going to have to ask ourselves the question. And even in talking to a lot of my fellow African-American brothers and sisters in this city, the question we always ask ourselves is, how can we get ourselves together? How can we get this right? And people on the continent of Africa, we're going to have to ask that question. And that answer is going to have to come from us. We can seek help from others, expanding that circle, but we're going to have to get this right by ourselves. I want to throw this to you, and you're well-versed, better well-versed than I am when it comes to the conversation of the continent of Asia. Growing up as a little kid, I remember watching American-produced movies where parents would tell a kid as they're trying to get their kid to eat your food, because if you don't, they're starving kids in China. Would you ever hear that phrase in today's world?
No.
Probably. Why is that? What has happened to China? Talk to us about China from the time you and I were little boys. What has happened economically there?
Well, the funny thing about that is the communist government would tell kids in Chinese school to save their change to send it to the starving children in America, in capitalist America.
Ain't that funny?
Which is kind of heartbreaking. But yeah, obviously, in the past 20 years, China has, I don't want to say too much. I don't know how much, because I'm not an expert on China, but state capitalism, they've built their industries, they've industrialized big time since the late 90s, and frankly, state capitalism makes them kind of a bad actor in the international
stage, right?
Yeah, on the global stage, and it's hard for free market or a mixed economy to compete with state capitalism, but mainly they've industrialized.
They have, and Dustin, wouldn't you agree? And your viewers could, they could check this out, do the research. I believe hundreds of millions of people in China have been lifted out of poverty into what they consider middle-class living, Chinese standard. While on the continent of Africa, we're still struggling to pull those from the rural areas into a middle-class urban life. Now, is it 100 million? Is it 300 million? I've heard different numbers. Is it 2 million? The point is, China is not the same country that it was 20, 30 years ago when you and I were little boys. They're certainly not that. Why is that the case? I believe, of course, there have been many factors. State capitalism, of course, is central to that. But you cannot deny that they led the charge. They did it.
Yeah.
And what I'm calling upon people who are in the African leadership circle is I'm not saying we have to mimic China. Our change, our growth is going to look different from China's. We need to come up with the solutions. It is wonderful that we have United States and people from Scandinavia and the United Kingdom and Canada trying to produce a better life for the average African. That is admirable. But for us to have sustained development, sustained growth, it's going to have to come from the ground up. Even I, Dustin, I was born and raised on the continent of Africa in Lusaka, Zambia. Having been away from the continent for 16 years, I am not well suited to provide the answers for what people on the ground need, because my perspective has been skewed. Now that I've been here, I can offer some suggestions, some pointers, but that's going to have to come from the people there. And all I ask is those who are in the foreign aid business. I'm not saying don't donate. I'm saying let's think about the long-term solutions and not just the short-term feel-good feelings that we get out of sending $1 or $2 a month to the starving kid.
I think that's what gets to the final thing of this part was the unintended consequences. I think a lot of well-meaning people here, maybe uncharitably characterized as white saviors will be a bit triggered or offended because they feel like they really are doing good. They feel like they're giving a gift. And they don't want to see their gift disparaged, or but I think the problem with a lot of the philanthropic minded people,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not a character flaw, I know they're totally well-meaning, is that they think of what they have to give, and they think of people receiving it,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't think of third parties that will be affected, and also how they might distort
Mm-hmm.
markets, or how they might incentivize someone else to act differently now that they've uh, implemented this aid. So one example I saw recently was there's a small shoe company in the United States that makes shoes. And for every pair you buy, they send one pair to Africa.
Okay.
And you think, okay, and I think we're probably on the same page. We see where the problem is here. So if you're a person in Africa who needs shoes, this is great. But if you're someone in Africa who makes shoes, you can't compete with free.
You can't.
And now you're out of business, and now there's another needy person.
Yep.
So that's when they say it creates dependency.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it is, because the market distortion, destroying. You said it destroys economies.
Right.
So what is do you know of other unintended consequences, or do you have more views?
Destroying the market is the big one. Propping up bad governments, like I spoke about a few minutes ago, is obviously another one. This is how I want to frame it for people, for my friends who are in the philanthropic community. And I was fortunate enough, one of my earlier professional opportunities that I had in Kansas City was for a nonprofit foundation here in Kansas City. So I have friends in that industry, and they do amazing work, saving lives, changing community. And most foundations, or most people who are in the philanthropic world, are about sustenance now, making sure that people are able to not only survive for now, but survive going forward for years to come. So I don't mean any disrespect to people in that industry, but what I will say is, every day when I drive to work, Dustin, one of the intersections, I come to a stop. It's a red light. I see hordes and hordes of homeless people here in Kansas City. Remember, America, the world's richest nation, best economy, and all that good stuff. I run into the homeless people all the time. You go anywhere in the city and you'll see homelessness, or at least signs of homelessness. The question I have for people who are watching this, who are listening to this, is I always feel compelled to give my change. $1 here. If I have a Subway sandwich, break it in half, give it to the homeless person. And I'm sure the person who receives the sandwich and the $1 is appreciative of that effort, is appreciative of the gesture. Wouldn't my time be better served in focusing on getting elected people, or people to get into elected offices who focus on homelessness? We just witnessed the first, maybe even the last presidential debate of this election cycle. How many times did you hear the word homelessness? You couldn't hear anything, by the way.
No.
But how many times, let's go back, 2016 debate between Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton. How many times is homelessness brought up? Think about the governor race here in the state of Missouri. How many times is homelessness addressed? It's never addressed. You know why? Because the majority of us are fine, whether we like it or not, seeing homeless people, handing them $1 and thinking we're doing something. If we're serious about homelessness, because I am, it bothers me, Dustin, that they're human beings. It's about to get cold outside. They have nowhere to go in the richest country on the earth. And we just drive by them every day, roll up our windows, shut our doors, turn down the music, don't make eye contact, and we think we're doing something. Hand them a little $1. Why not focus on what causes homelessness in America? Go out west, San Francisco, LA, Chicago. When I've traveled to these places, I'm literally stepping over people who are homeless with their signs, with their kids. So it's the same concept with the continent of Africa. You think you're doing something by donating, but you're not addressing the issue. We need to pivot over to situations, to ideas that allow for sustained growth to address the issue. Why are people homeless in America? Why are people in the continent of Africa not where they need to be economically? We need to get to that. The bags of rice are great. the medicines are great, and I say let's keep at it, but we need to have a twofold strategy. Feed them today and allow them, support them to find answers for tomorrow.
My response for why they didn't talk about homelessness is probably even more cynical, because homeless can't vote, or by and large, if you don't have an address, you're probably not voting. So,
Nobody cares for them.
So they're not maybe politicians don't actually see them as a constituency.
Absolutely.
But let's try to go on to, I'm trying to be respectful of your time. We
Sure,
have
yeah.
10 minutes or so left.
Yeah.
Let's go on and end on what might work. And I had some ideas, and I'd like to bounce them off.
Sure.
But the main one is, if you are going to give money, that every effort needs to be taken to ensure that it goes directly to the people, and the way that distorts markets the least. And as unexciting as it sounds, I think that just straight up giving cash directly to people who need it. But that, I think that might be one of the prerequisites. But what do you think would work?
Sure, and this is where a lot of people think I'm more liberal than conservative. Government is the key. Is the key to economic development, I believe. People say it's citizen. You have to have a government that is fair, that respects its citizens, and creates an environment where people can succeed. Without that, when there's poor governance, there's no development. That's a fact. I'll debate anybody on any given day. So when we're talking about solutions, we need here in the United States to ensure that the people that we elect are people who have that mindset that wants to help others and the least of these, both home and abroad. So we need to support people with platforms that want to rethink foreign aid. See, foreign aid, the discussion you and I are having is not, should we continue with foreign aid or not? I'm saying we need it. We just need to reimagine it, re-envision it. And what does that look like for me, in my humble opinion? A lot of American homes, when I go in there, people love to decorate their homes, right? A lot of people are fascinated by artifacts, trinkets from the continent of Africa to spice up their home, give it a little international flavor. Well, why not figure out how we can support organizations here in the United States that partner with local artists in Zambia? So when they build their product, we can buy them, whether it's at a discount or not. We're still giving money, it's transfer money, but we're incentivizing work. The African artist is building his woodwork, his craft. He or she may be doing that, and we're supporting that. So in turn, that person will get the money, has to buy material. We're propping up the economy there versus dropping the bag of rice. Now, we could drop in the bag of rice with the helicopter, but can we also support local industry? So that's how I'm reimagining, re-envisioning, if that's a word, foreign aid, supporting local businesses, trade. Why can't we? I came here as an international student. I was fortunate to have a family that could support me to do that. Why don't we allow some of our brightest kids from the continent of Africa, they don't even have to be the brightest ones, have them come here to the United States for a semester and expose them to how the college life is here, and ensure we get them back home. That could be different. To allow somebody who's never owned a vehicle to get on a plane and fly. Imagine how that opens up their mind. And when they come here and see something different, you see, I think what's lacking at home, when I speak of home Zambia, is imagination. The average kid in my class when I was growing up in secondary school, in primary school, high school, could recite anything you asked them. But if you ask them, how does this apply in real life? That was a struggle. And why is that the case? Because of the lack of imagination. So when we're talking about foreign aid, it's not only money, it's not only resources. How can we open up minds? Dustin, the conversation you're having with me today in 2020 is not the same conversation you would have had with me in 2003, not just because I've aged and I don't have my afro anymore. It's because my perspective has changed. And why has it changed? because I've been afforded opportunities to learn about different things. And who knows, Dustin, one day I may end up back at home. Who knows what I will take back at home. So again, supporting local businesses, I gave you an example of one, exposing people to other cultures, other opportunities is two. And I would also suggest that when we think about foreign aid, Dustin, and I want to be careful how I word this. So I want to frame it so people understand what I'm saying. I think I'll leave the point. I think also creating economic opportunity zones. What do I mean by that? And this is closely tied to the trade piece. Why not allow people on the continent of Africa or in Zambia to build stuff that we don't even need, but just pay for it? Imagine what that would do psychologically to the people on that continent. They don't know what we're doing. We bought 10 handcrafted tables from Africa, bring them over here and just keep them in the warehouse. They won't know that, but to incentivize people to do something is key. You're a student of history. What happened during the Great Depression when FDR was the president? He was hiring through the WPA, if I'm not mistaken, or the Public Works Program, however, whatever the acronym was. They were hiring Americans to dig holes and fill them up.
Yep.
Why? To get them out of their homes, to give them a paycheck. There's nothing more of a booster of your self-worth than having a job. So let's incentivize that.
Yeah, I think there are two approaches, and one is the jobs, because there's dignity in work.
Yes.
And it is a thing that pays. I was talking about just giving money, but no strings attached, because which would be like the opposite approach.
Sure.
But I think a lot of the aid programs now assume we know better how to spend the money than they would. And I think that's a little bit patronizing. I think if you give the money to the family, they're probably going to spend it in the way they see best, maybe not exactly the way you would, but I feel like that's somewhat efficient. But I think another prerequisite that you haven't even mentioned yet is property rights. The Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto's book, which is, let's say, maybe 20 or 30 years old now, The Mystery of Capital. He thought just securing and enforcing property rights would go a long way, and that makes a lot of sense. I know it sounds kind of right-wing, and I'm no right-winger, but if your family's lived on this land for generations, but there's no piece of paper that says you own it, and if there was, it wouldn't matter anyway.
It wouldn't matter anyway.
For one thing, you don't have any collateral if you wanted to invest, or if you wanted to leverage the property to invest in improving it. And two, if you did invest and improve it, let's stop some corrupt politician just taking it and giving it to one of his cronies because you don't really own it. Just throwing that out there. I know we don't have a lot of time.
No.
I feel like it's a prerequisite.
You brought up a great point, and the issue of ownership and property rights on the continent of Africa, it's very messy. You've seen what's happened in Zimbabwe, where there was land grabbing and all of that drama that came with that. That's a valid point, and I would personally support that, where we could get to a point where we're supporting initiatives, endeavors by African governments that ensure that the local people have property rights, that they can invest, that they can build. That's what I mean by trade, by economics. That's the only way I believe we're going to get out of this rut that we're in right now. And as you and I speak, hopefully this podcast gets to live for another 100 years. I would hope, and I'm hopeful, that those watching this 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, when you and I are long gone, will say, wow, What a different time. Because look, Africa is now the paradise of the world. Everyone wants to immigrate to Africa. I would hope that, and I'm optimistic that that will happen. One thing I did say with the last few moments that I didn't say, Dustin, and this will be very controversial. I might lose friends, so I need to be.
Let's throw it out here at the very end.
Yeah, and we were doing great till this point, so people will be like, why did you say that? Dustin, I grew up Catholic. Zambia is a Christian nation. That's etched in the Constitution in Zambia. I can't tell you how many homes I went to where the image of the Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, whom I believe in, was a white guy, blonde hair, blue eyes. Now just stop and think. I gotta ask your listeners this, and I say it's controversial. If the person who died for my sins and who I claim is my Lord and Savior doesn't look one bit like me, subconsciously, every white person that comes in contact with me is also a God. Now you say, ooh, that's a stretch. That's a stretch. And you're like, and I know your listeners will say that.
I didn't think you were going there. But
that's where I'm going. And I need to go there because this is that type of show. You told me it was this kind of a podcast, and
this is anything.
This is anything. So I got to put it out there.
Time.
There's an inferiority complex on the African continent, and it stems and it's tied to our religious beliefs. I am a proud Christian, but do I believe the Lord Jesus Christ, my Lord Savior, was blue, had blue eyes and blonde?
This Middle Eastern Jew was blonde hair, blue.
He was a Middle Eastern Jew. His complexion was closer to me than it is to you. Yeah. So the question I have to ask on the continent, why is it that the people that we worship, the people we look up to, the people that we see as gods don't even look like us? So this contributes to us failing to find our own answers. I'm just going to wait for Dustin from America to solve my problems because guess what? He's godlike. And I'm here to tell if there are any viewers, any listeners on the continent of Africa, it's time for us to believe in ourselves. It's time for us to take ownership of our history, our faith, our religion. You can be a proud Christian, but let's not fall for the okie doke that has been given to us because it has been played to us in such a way that we feel everything is wrong. In my book, Dustin, a good chunk of the book, I go by the name John, by the way.
Amazon right now.
Amazon, $12. You can't beat it. It's a weekend read, folks. It's a weekend read. Half of that book, I go by the name of John. In fact, at UMKC, my first few years in Kansas City, I went by the name John. Why? Because I thought there was a problem with the name Chiluba. It wasn't just that I was scared people would butcher the name and couldn't pronounce it. I thought there was something wrong with me. That's why my first friends, that's why I couldn't even chastise them when that young lady said, oh, you're practically white. I should have said, whoa, no, I'm proudly African. But I was feeding the beast because of my own inferiority complex. And that complex stems from the time you're a little kid all the way until you're an adult. They tell us there's something wrong. What were the religious beliefs before the first missionaries came on the continent of Africa? We will never know. We will never know because our religion was taken away from us. Our names were taken away from us. We are told there's something wrong with our hair, something wrong with our actions. And Black folk in this country can relate. They can relate to what I'm saying because there's this, and I don't think people do it deliberately. I just think that's the way the world has been crafted. And I want to tell people, brothers on the continent, Black folk here, there's nothing wrong with us. There's nothing wrong with our names. People used to tell me African-American sounding names are ghetto. What do you mean? What do you mean? I don't know any, you might know some who are Americanized. I don't know a single person who looks Asian and traces their roots from China or South Korea who has two names that are European, unless they immigrated here and there was some intermarrying going on, and there's nothing wrong with that, or they renamed themselves. I'm not saying there's a problem with your names. I'm just trying to say, on average, when you see you get to look at resumes and you see a name, Charles Taylor, you can't tell if that person's Black or white. But guess what? When you see the name Chiluba Musonda, you know I'm from somewhere else, and you should know I'm from somewhere else, and that there's nothing wrong with that. Africans, African Americans, and other cultures. I know people think it's just to blend in and fit in. It's part of being one big happy culture and assimilating. But protect your culture, protect your history. And while we're talking about foreign aid and all of that stuff, we also have to learn to understand that we are okay the way we are. I love every human being on this earth that I come in contact with. I really do. You know that. I'm a people person. I shake every hand, try and kiss every baby. Well, it's COVID now. I can't do that anymore. I'll give you the elbow. But Dustin, we have to be reminded that there's nothing wrong with our culture. There's nothing wrong with ourselves. Go out and get the book, folks. Go out and get the books. It's $12, home away from home. Thank you, Dustin.
So when we were in Boston, we touched on this. We didn't get a chance to tour the Sam Adams factory. But we were planning to make a trip up to Milwaukee, visit beer country, visit all our fine breweries. So it's a token of my appreciation.
What do you have for me? Uh-oh.
I brought you a flight.
Oh my goodness.
Of Milwaukee's premium brews.
Now,
So we got Miller, we got PBR, Milwaukee's best, Old Milwaukee, Schlitz, all the finest breweries.
You
down
have
there. And if any of these companies are watching and you want to sponsor this show for one time only, I'll offer $500,000. I will sponsor. I will. If you sponsor me, I will plug your beverage on every episode. That offer won't last forever, so reach out.
Dustin, thank you, by the way. I'm so moved by this. I am no alcoholic, folks, but Dustin knows me all too well. I don't mind a beer here or there. And it's funny, Miller High Life, I enjoy it pretty much. And the truth of the matter is there's a joke behind this. The prices of alcohol in Boston was just crazy. And at some point, one of the nights, I turned to Dustin and said, hey, man, I could buy like a 24-pack of Milwaukee's best instead of this one bottle of Sam Adams that I had in that bar. So I love this, Dustin. Let's support our local beer industry. And thank you so much. I mean, this is good stuff. This is the good stuff, folks. This is the good stuff.
I had to drink 36 cans of, or 30 cans of crappy beer to make this. I mean, I had to drink 30 cans of premium brews to make this flight of the sampler of Milwaukee's finest. Last question, I saved the hardest for last.
Sure.
Africa by Toto. Great song or the greatest song?
It's gonna take a long way from you. I can't
I'm
sing.
just kidding. Nobody really likes that song.
Hold on.
You like it ironically.
I bless the rains down in Africa. I love that song. And you know what? There have been so many different versions. Weird Al has done it, and Avant, an African-American R&B singer, has done his own version. I love that song. I don't find that song condescending at all. I just don't. I don't. And by the way, one of the best albums ever put together was by Paul Simon. I think it was back in 1986. It was called Graceland. It was an album he recorded in Zimbabwe or South Africa, if I'm not mistaken. And the backup vocals and some of the lead vocals are by a band called Ladysmith Black Mambazo from South Africa. Shout out to Paul Simon. Shout out to anybody who tries to put the best foot forward when it comes to the content of Africa. And Dustin, thank you. Thank you for giving me the platform. I did not mean to be controversial. Thank you for allowing me to speak my truths. And thank you, and I wish you all the best with this podcast.
Well, thank you. You're doing me a favor. Otherwise, I'd be talking to myself about things I don't know that much about. So, all right, thanks for being here.
Thank you.